All right, welcome back to the Deep Dive. It is Monday, February 23rd, 2026. And look, usually we start these things with a bit of a warm-up, maybe a joke or some light banter, but honestly, I can't really do that today.
Yeah, no, it's heavy out there right now, really heavy.
If you've been anywhere near a screen, a phone, a tablet, your wall monitor, whatever, in the last 48 hours, you know exactly why we're skipping the jokes.
The images coming out of Minnesota, they just don't look like the America we were talking about even 5 years ago.
Intense doesn't even begin to cover it.
Yeah.
I mean, we are seeing what looks like a total standoff between federal agents and local communities. I was watching the live feed from Minneapolis this morning, the Operation Metro Surge footage.
Right, the Metro Surge.
And it looked like a scene from some dystopian cyberpunk movie. You've got smoke in the streets, drones flying overhead, people literally barricading their own neighborhoods.
And it's not just isolated to the Midwest either. You look at Alameda Street in Los Angeles right now, you've got thousands of protesters facing off against law enforcement.
But what is really striking to me is the visual language of it all. If you look closely at the footage, you see flags from half a dozen different nations being waved.
I saw that.
You've got Mexico, Honduras, El Salvador. I even saw PRC flags, Chinese flags, right alongside the standard protest signs. It feels incredibly chaotic, like something has just fundamentally snapped in the social fabric.
Exactly. It feels broken. And the standard narrative we usually hear on the nightly news, the one you've probably heard a million times, is that this is a, quote, failure of policy.
Right, the old talking points.
Yeah, you know them. The border is broken, or the immigration system is overwhelmed, or Congress failed to act again. We're constantly told this is a humanitarian crisis spiraling out of control purely because of incompetence or partisan gridlock.
If only we had a better bill, this wouldn't be happening. That's always...
Today, we're going to look at a source that argues the complete polar opposite. We're doing a deep dive into a book that basically says, stop calling this a failure. It is not a failure.
It's a success. A success. And that is, well, that's a really provocative way to put it.
It is provocative. But the source we're covering today argues that what we are seeing, the chaos, the tension, the sheer numbers, the clashes with the Metro Surge, all of it is the successful execution of a strategy.
A strategy.
A military and political strategy.
That is a terrifying thought to start a Monday with. But it brings us right to the center of today's deep dive. We are talking about the book that just hit #1 on the New York Times bestseller list.
Which is a huge deal considering the immense controversy around it.
Massive controversy. The book is titled The Invisible Coup: How American Elites and Foreign Powers Use Immigration as a Weapon. And it's by the investigative journalist Peter Schweitzer.
And we should establish right away, Schweitzer is a heavyweight in this space. He's the guy who wrote Clinton Cash and Red Handed. His whole brand is he follows the money. He follows the power structures. And in this new book, he is introducing a concept to the public that he calls strategic engineered migration.
Strategic engineered migration. Okay, let's unpack that term immediately. Because migration usually implies people moving organically, right? Because they want a better life.
Yeah, exactly.
But engineered implies someone is literally building a machine.
That's the perfect way to look at it. The core thesis of the book is that mass migration is being weaponized. It's not random. It's not just natural market forces or climate change driving people north.
So what is it?
According to Schweitzer, it is being deliberately created, manipulated, and directed by foreign powers and assisted by domestic elites to achieve very specific political goals. Goals that they could never achieve through traditional warfare or even traditional voting.
Weaponized migration. I mean, it sounds like something out of a geopolitical thriller, but here we are in February 2026, and this book isn't just sitting on bookstore shelves gathering dust.
No, it is actively shaping policy.
We are hearing reports, very credible reports, that the Trump administration, now deep into its second term, is utilizing this specific book as a primary piece of evidence.
That is the high-stakes context we really need to keep in the front of our minds for this entire deep dive.
Yeah, tell them about April.
Right, so we have a massive Supreme Court case coming up in April. That is just 2 months away. And it is regarding birthright citizenship.
A foundational part of American law.
Absolutely. And the White House is reportedly preparing to argue that the 14th Amendment is actively being weaponized by foreign adversaries. And they are using Schweitzer's research, the exact stuff we are discussing today, to prove it legally in front of the court.
So just to be clear for everyone listening, this isn't just theory, this isn't just some guy ranting online. This book is forming the legal argument for the administration's current crackdown.
The stakes could not be higher.
So here's our roadmap for today's deep dive. We need to thoroughly unpack this invisible coup. We're going to look at the history first, the proof of concept that shows how this weapon was actually tested decades ago.
Then we're going to break down the specific strategies of the foreign powers mentioned in the book. Specifically, we'll look at Mexico and China.
And spoiler alert for that part, their strategies are completely different, but they aim for the exact same result.
Exactly. And we also can't forget the domestic collaborator section. That is the coup part of the book's title, the idea that this is happening from the inside. We have to ask the question, who is opening the gates?
And finally, we have to connect all of this historical and strategic analysis to what is happening right now, outside our windows. The deaths in Minnesota, the economic blackout protests, all of it.
There's a lot of ground to cover.
So buckle up. This is going to be a heavy one.
Yeah.
But remember, we are just laying out what the source material argues. We're looking at the anatomy of this theory. Let's start with the blueprint. Schweitzer argues this isn't a new phenomenon.
Not at all. He says we've seen this movie before, we just didn't understand the plot at the time.
Right. And he points to 1980, the Mariel boat lift.
Yes. Fidel Castro.
I think most people, if they remember it at all, they probably just remember the movie Starface. Or maybe they remember those vague, grainy news clips of Cubans fleeing communism on rickety boats.
The standard narrative was very simple. Castro is a tyrant, his economy is failing, and people are fleeing for freedom in America.
That was definitely the narrative I grew up with.
Right, but Schweitzer says if you actually look at the internal documents from that time, it was much, much more calculated than a simple refugee crisis. It was a masterclass in what he calls coercive engineered migration.
So how did Castro actually engineer it?
Well, you have to remember the context of 1980. Castro was facing massive internal unrest. The Cuban economy was absolutely tanking. People were starving. They were unhappy. He had a major domestic problem on his hands.
So usually a dictator in that situation just cracks down, brings out the military, arrests everyone.
He could have done that. But he did something much smarter. He announced to the world that anyone who wants to leave Cuba can leave. He opens the port of Mariel.
Okay.
But, and this is the crucial key to the whole strategy, he didn't just let the dissidents go.
He emptied the prisons.
He literally emptied the jails and the mental asylums. He went to the hardest, darkest corners of the Cuban penal system and basically said, you are going to America.
Unbelievable.
He forced legitimate refugees, the families, the political dissidents, who actually just wanted freedom to take hardened criminals and the vividly mentally ill with them on those boats.
And Schweitzer has a very specific term for this, right?
He does. He calls it using refugees as human camouflage.
Human camouflage. Oh, that's such a chilling phrase. It really implies that the legitimate refugees are just the packaging for the actual weapon.
It's a harsh term, but it's completely accurate to the strategy. You flood your adversary, in this case the United States, under Jimmy Carter, with a massive wave of humanity.
Us.
And hidden within that wave are agents of chaos.
Spies, criminals.
Spies, yes, but mostly just people who will drain social services, skyrocket local crime rates, and create absolute panic in American cities.
There is a quote in the book from Jack Watson that really stuck with me.
Oh, the Carter administration quote?
Yeah. He was the White House chief of staff for Jimmy Carter at the time. This is the guy effectively running the West Wing while the boats are landing in Florida.
Right.
And Watson said, quote, Castro is using people like bullets aimed at this country.
Using people like bullets, it totally changes the perspective of what a border crisis is.
So the argument here is that a weaker nation, a tiny island like Cuba, could inflict massive systemic damage on a global superpower like the U.S. without firing a single actual shot.
Precisely. They just overwhelmed our legal and social systems. And this historical example connects to a really important theory by a political scientist named Kelly Greenhill.
Let's get into Greenhill's work, because Schweitzer leans on her theory heavily in the book.
He does. Greenhill calls this tactic, migration, as asymmetric warfare.
Okay, let's break that down for the listener. Asymmetric warfare usually means the little guy fighting the big guy using non-traditional means, like guerrilla tactics in the jungle.
Yes, exactly. But in this framework, the weapon isn't an IED or an ambush. The weapon is people. Greenhill argues that this tactic specifically exploits the core vulnerabilities of liberal democracies. She calls it imposing hypocrisy costs.
Hypocrisy costs. I really like that term. What does it actually mean in practice, though?
Think about it this way. The United States prides itself on human rights. on being a sanctuary for the oppressed. The Statue of Liberty, give me your tired, your poor. That is our global brand.
It's our identity.
Right. So if a hostile dictator suddenly pushes 100,000 desperate people toward your border, the democracy is completely trapped. You basically have two choices.
Okay, what's choice A?
Choice A is you repel them. You can shoot them, you can turn them away violently, you can mine the harbors or militarize the border to the point of lethal force.
But if you do that...
If you do that, you destroy your moral standing. You look like a monster on the world stage. And worse, your own citizens will revolt against the cruelty of it. You pay a massive hypocrisy cost.
You betray your own stated values. You become the bad guy.
Exactly. The dictator forces you to either be a hypocrite or a monster. Or you go with choice B.
Which is, you let them in.
You let them in, and if you let them in all at once, in those numbers,
you destabilize your own society.
You overwhelm your schools, your hospitals, your police departments. You create massive political polarization, which is exactly what happened to Jimmy Carter. The Mariel boat lift arguably cost him the 1980 election against Reagan.
It's a lose-lose situation for the democracy.
And a total win-win for the dictator. Castro got rid of his undesirables, lowered his own crime rate, and destabilized the American administration that was sanctioning him. It worked perfectly.
And Schweitzer's main point in the book is that this wasn't just a one-off historical event. It was the proof of concept. It was the beta test for what we are seeing today.
Right. And now, in 2026, he argues that other nations have adopted this exact strategy, but they have scaled it up to a massive industrial level.
Which brings us to Mexico.
Let's talk about Mexico. This is a huge part of the book, and honestly, probably the most controversial part of Schweitzer's analysis.
Because we share a 2,000-mile border with them. We are massive trade partners. We aren't at war. But Schweitzer argues that the relationship has fundamentally shifted beneath the surface. He says it's not just about labor anymore.
No, the argument here is that Mexico has moved from being a passive source of labor, people just coming over looking for work and sending remittances back home, to being an active, aggressive geopolitical player.
And he uses a very specific, historically loaded term for this strategy.
The conquista.
Reconquista. I mean, historically, that refers to the Christian reconquest of Spain from the Moors centuries ago. But in this context, we're talking about the American Southwest.
In a demographic and cultural sense, yes. Now, Schweitzer isn't saying Mexico is going to roll tanks into Texas or Arizona. That's old warfare.
Right.
He discusses the concept of Patria Grande, or the Great Fatherland. It's this ideological concept, very popular in certain Latin American leftist political circles, of erasing the borders that were imposed by, quote, imperialists.
So effectively extending Mexican sovereignty northwards into the U.S. without firing a shot.
Yes.
But how do you actually execute that? I mean, surely they aren't engaging in open military conflict.
No, as we said, tanks are obsolete in this kind of warfare. You don't use the military. You use bureaucracy. You use diplomacy. You use consulates.
This part of the book blew my mind. The statistics on the consulates.
Schweitzer points out a staggering statistic that I actually had to go and double-check myself because it sounded impossibly high. Mexico operates 53 consulates inside the United States.
53. That seems completely excessive. I mean, for context, how many does a major ally like France have?
France has 10. The UK has maybe 8 or 9. 53 is a massive, sprawling network. It is almost one consulate for every single U.S. state.
And Schweitzer alleges that these aren't just places where you go to get your passport renewed, right? Or get legal help if you're a tourist who got arrested.
Not at all. He describes these 53 consulates as forward operating bases for political organizing.
Organizing who, exactly?
The Mexican diaspora. The millions of Mexican nationals currently living in the U.S. The goal, according to the internal sources and memos Schweitzer cites, is to maintain their loyalty to Mexico and actively prevent their assimilation into American culture.
So they are actively discouraging people from becoming culturally American.
Yes. There is a specific case study in the book that perfectly illustrates this, and it's frankly astonishing. The case of Alejandro Robles Gomez.
I read this chapter. This is the guy who is a politician, right?
He is a senior official in the Morena Party. That is the ruling political party in Mexico, the party of AMLO and now Sheinbaum.
Okay.
But here's the kicker. He holds a seat in the Mexican parliament, but he actually lives in Ontario, California.
Wait, hold on. Look at this straight. He is a sitting member of the Mexican federal government, casting votes on laws in Mexico City, but his primary day-to-day residence is in Southern California.
Correct.
How is that even legal?
It exploits dual residency loopholes. But what's really important is that he isn't quiet about his goals. He openly talks in speeches about, quote, organizing the militancy inside the U.S.
Organizing the militancy, those are his exact words.
That is his exact phrase, translated from Spanish. He views the Mexican population living in the U.S. not as new Americans, but as a lever of power for the Mexican state.
A political weapon.
He wants them to vote in U.S., local, and state elections to serve Mexican national interests, and he even encourages them to resist U.S. federal law when it conflicts with those Mexican interests.
I mean, that does not sound like friendly diplomatic talk between trade partners. That sounds like, well, it sounds like building a fifth column.
That is precisely the term Schweitzer uses, a fifth column, a massive group within a host country that remains fundamentally loyal to a foreign power.
And just recently, in February 2026, literally this month, Rosas was back in the news.
Yes, because he was terrified he would be denied entry back into the United States after visiting Mexico. He knows his portrayal in Schweitzer's book exposes this entire strategy to the mainstream.
He claimed he was worried about a, quote, racist border agent stopping him.
Right, but the core issue isn't race. The issue is that he is a foreign government official operating politically on U.S. soil to subvert U.S. laws.
It totally complicates the whole idea of national sovereignty, doesn't it? If you have foreign legislators living in California, organizing millions of people to resist local laws, that is the textbook definition of a state within a state.
And if you want to ensure that this loyalty to the foreign state spans across multiple generations, you need to control their education. Or, as Schweitzer argues, their re-education.
Which brings us to the textbooks. The SP initiative. This was wild to read about.
The Mexican Ministry of Public Education, known by its Spanish acronym SP, for the 2025 school year, they printed and distributed 140 million textbooks.
A massive print run.
But they didn't just keep them inside Mexico's borders. Schweitzer details how these textbooks are systematically distributed to Mexican nationals inside the United States.
Through that massive network of 53 consulates. And what are these books actually teaching? Are they just teaching Spanish grammar? Are they teaching basic math?
Quite the opposite. According to the translation and analysis in the book, they explicitly teach political loyalty to the Mexican state, and they reframe U.S. history.
How so?
They don't teach that the U.S. is a beacon of freedom or opportunity. They frame the United States as an imperialist antagonist that actively stole Mexican territory.
So imagine a kid growing up in, say, Chicago. They go to an American public school during the day, learning standard curriculum, but then on weekends or at after-school community centers run by the local consulate.
They are studying these SP textbooks.
Right.
The primary goal is to prevent Americanization. If you can keep that massive population culturally distinct, aggrieved, and politically loyal to the homeland, you maintain that geopolitical leverage forever.
It creates a population that is physically existing in the United States, utilizing U.S. infrastructure, but politically and culturally bound to Mexico City.
That is the essence of the Reconquista strategy Schweitzer is warning about. It's not a military invasion, it's a demographic absorption.
Okay, so that is the strategy of mass migration. Overwhelming numbers, leveraging the working class, cultural retention. But Schweitzer says there is another major player in this invisible coup.
And their strategy is completely different.
Let's talk about China, because we're not seeing millions of Chinese nationals wading across the Rio Grande in the same way.
No, China plays the long game. Their approach isn't about flooding the southern border with millions of poor laborers. The CCP doesn't need labor in the U.S.
Right.
Their approach is elite. It's high-tech, it's financial, and it is highly specific. Schweitzer calls their strategy the creation of the Manchurian generation.
The Manchurian generation. I mean, that sounds like a spy thriller movie title, like the Manchurian Candidate. Brainwashed sleeper agents. What does it actually mean in this legal and demographic context?
It refers to a generation of children who are technically legally American citizens, but who are raised entirely in China with absolute loyalty to the Chinese Communist Party.
This is the birth tourism angle of the book.
Birth tourism, yes, but highly evolved. I mean, we've known about birth tourism for years. Wealthy foreign nationals flying into Los Angeles or Saipan on a tourist visa, giving birth in a hospital so the kid gets a blue American passport, and then flying home.
Right. It's been a known loophole.
But Schweitzer claims the scale of it now is industrial. And with advancements in IVF and commercial surrogacy, wealthy CCP members and Chinese elites don't even have to come to America physically anymore to get an American baby.
Explain that process. How do they do it without even stepping foot in the country?
They hire an American surrogate through an agency, a woman living in Idaho or Ohio or Texas. They ship the biological material, the embryos, to a U.S. clinic.
Wow.
The surrogate carries the child. The child is born on U.S. soil, immediately gets a U.S. birth certificate, immediately gets a U.S. passport, and then as a newborn infant is handed over and immediately flown back to mainland China.
So you have a child who is fundamentally a U.S. citizen by birth.
But they are raised entirely in the Chinese education system. They go to Communist Party schools. They are indoctrinated by the CCP from kindergarten onwards. They speak fluent Mandarin. They might not even speak English. Their parents are wealthy Chinese elites.
But in the eyes of U.S. federal law, they are as American as you or me.
Exactly.
And what are the numbers on this? How many kids are we talking about?
Schweitzer estimates there could be up to 1 million of these children currently in existence.
1 million.
That is the claim in the book. And think about the long-term national security implications of that. When those 1 million kids turn 18, they have the constitutional right to vote in U.S. elections.
They can fly back here, establish residency, and vote.
They can apply for top-secret security clearances. They can run for political office. They can work in our tech sector, our defense sector. They are legally Americans, but their entire worldview and allegiance have been shaped by America's primary geopolitical adversary.
They are quite literally using the 14th Amendment birthright citizenship against us. It is a legal loophole the size of the Pacific Ocean.
Exactly. The 14th Amendment was written and ratified in 1868. Its historical purpose was to ensure that former slaves were recognized as full citizens after the Civil War.
It was a massive civil rights triumph.
It was, but it was never, ever intended by its authors to allow a foreign adversary a century and a half later to breed a generation of citizens for strategic geopolitical leverage.
And this is precisely why the Trump administration is taking this specific issue to the Supreme Court in April.
Right. The White House isn't arguing against the general rights of immigrants. They're arguing that this specific mechanism, strategic, state-sponsored birth tourism, is a direct national security threat.
So what's their legal angle going to be?
They want to argue before the court that the 14th Amendment shouldn't apply if the intent behind the birth is hostile to the United States. That sovereignty requires intent, not just geography.
It's going to be the trial of the century. But the Chinese strategy isn't just about the kids. Schweitzer devotes a lot of time to the money, too.
Yes, the financial subversion.
Let's talk about the EB-5 visas.
The Golden Visa program. This has been around for quite a while. The basic premise is if you are a foreign national and you invest a certain amount of money, usually around $800,000 to $1 million, into a U.S. commercial enterprise that creates American jobs, you get a green card.
On the surface, that seems like a good deal for us. We get foreign investment to build things, and they get a visa.
In theory, yes. But Schweitzer tracks how this specific program has been overwhelmingly utilized and arguably monopolized by Chinese nationals connected to the state. And here is the massive political loophole.
Okay, what's the loophole?
Once you secure a green card through EB-5, you are legally classified as a permanent resident of the United States. And do you know what permanent residents can legally do in the U.S. regarding politics?
Well, they can't vote. You have to be a citizen to vote.
No, they can't cast a ballot, but they can donate money. Yes, it is a massive backdoor for foreign dark money.
Because foreign nationals cannot donate to U.S. political campaigns. That's illegal.
Correct. But a green card holder can. So if Beijing gets enough operatives or sympathetic business elites green cards via this EB-5 investment program, those individuals can funnel millions of dollars of Chinese money into U.S. political passies and campaigns completely legally.
It effectively allows the Chinese Communist Party to indirectly fund U.S. political candidates who are friendly to their interests.
It's a way to buy influence from the inside, using our own immigration and campaign finance laws as the mechanism.
It's brilliant in a really dark way. And then there's the military aspect, which is just as brazen. The book details a clandestine scheme happening right now in California and Arizona involving civilian flight schools.
This part sounds completely absurd, but the documentation is there.
We are literally training their military pilots.
Yes. Chinese military pilots, active PLA members, posing as civilians, enrolling in standard U.S. flight schools out west.
Why? Don't they have flight schools in China?
They do, but they want to get training on Western flight tactics, Western airspace procedures, and Western aircraft handling. They get the training here, legally, on student visas, and then they take that advanced knowledge right back to the Chinese military.
So they are boosting Beijing's military capabilities using American civilian infrastructure.
Exactly.
So let's just pause here and look at the map of what we've covered. We have Mexico working the demographic and political angle on the ground, the mass migration strategy.
Right.
We have China working the elite, financial, and strategic angle from the top down. But the book is titled The Invisible Coup.
Yes.
And the word coup implies that this isn't just a foreign invasion. It implies traitors. It implies that people inside the house are helping unlock the doors.
And this brings us to section 4 of our deep dive, the domestic collaborators. This is where Schweitzer gets really scathing in his analysis. He asks the fundamental question, why is this allowed to happen?
Right. Why would the U.S. government, which spends billions on defense, let this persist for decades? And the answer isn't just incompetence, is it?
No. Schweitzer argues it's not just that they are bad at their jobs or the bureaucracy is slow. He argues that domestic political elites actively benefit from this chaos. It is intentional.
To prove this, he goes back into the history books again. He looks at the Clinton administration.
Yes, to show the historical precedent for domestic collaboration. He does a deep dive into a program from 1996 called CUSA, Citizenship USA.
1996. Let's set the stage. Bill Clinton is running for re-election against Bob Dole.
Yeah.
And it was a much tighter race in the polling than people remember today.
Exactly. The Democrats were worried Clinton needed guaranteed votes in swing states. Enter a man named Harold Ikes.
Garbage man.
That was his actual political nickname in D.C. He was the deputy chief of staff for Clinton. He was the guy who cleaned up the messes and did the dirty work. And he was put in charge of running the CUSA program.
What was the stated goal of CUSA?
The goal was to drastically accelerate the naturalization process. They wanted to mint over 1 million new citizens before the November 1996 election. They calculated they needed those specific demographic numbers to swing key states like California, Illinois, and Florida.
But to naturalize 1 million people that fast, immigration bureaucracy is notoriously painfully slow.
Right, so they gutted the safeguards. Schweitzer produces internal memos in the book showing that the administration intentionally skipped mandatory background checks.
Just skip them entirely.
They ignored massive FBI fingerprint backlogs. They told the processors to just push the paperwork through. They were literally rubber stamping known criminals and even suspected terrorists just to get bodies onto the voter rolls before Election Day.
Schweitzer calls it a voter mill.
A voter mill?
So national security took a deliberate backseat to electoral strategy.
That is the core argument. And Schweitzer says this wasn't just a one-time scandal in the 90s. It was the blueprint for modern progressive politics. He connects the CUSA program directly to the strategies we saw deployed during the Biden-Harris era and the current massive resistance to Trump's second term.
He argues that the recent parole programs, the CBP One app, the massive asylum frauds, it's all just the modern, tech-enabled evolution of CUSA.
It's about importing a permanent political underclass that will vote for the party that gives them benefits.
And it's not just the politicians in Washington doing this. The book talks a lot about people he calls change agents.
This is where we have to look at the powerful public sector unions, specifically the SEIU and progressive activist groups. And this is crucial for the listener to understand. Schweitzer's isn't putting words in their mouths. He quotes their own literature and leaders directly.
Right, he uses their own strategy documents.
He quotes union leaders who state explicitly that they don't just see migrants as poor people needing humanitarian help. They view them strategically as political change agents.
Explain that distinction for us. What is the difference between a refugee and a change agent?
A refugee is someone who needs temporary safety and wants to integrate into their new home. A change agent is a political tool.
Oh, yeah.
If you bring in millions of people from countries with deeply ingrained socialist traditions, or people who arrive completely destitute and are immediately dependent on the state for survival housing, food, healthcare, and you actively prevent them from assimilating into traditional American individualist culture, you create a permanent, massive voting bloc that will always support big government expansion.
You create a demographic force designed to dismantle free market capitalism and traditional American constitutional values from the ground up.
Precisely. That is the stated goal of these change agents.
So the whole sanctuary city infrastructure, the massive NGOs, the nonprofits we hear about, they aren't just charities operating out of the goodness of their hearts.
Schweitzer alleges that many of them, some of which are funded by literally billions in federal taxpayer dollars, actually act as the taxpayer-funded logistics arm of this invisible coup.
They handle the ground game.
They move people from the border towns in Texas and Arizona, put them on planes and buses, and funnel them directly into tight political swing states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. Not just for humanitarian reasons, but to permanently alter the political demographics of the Electoral College.
It's an incredibly heavy accusation. He's basically saying that humanitarian charity is being used as a shield for asymmetric political warfare against the American public.
And speaking of charity being used as a shield, that brings us to perhaps the most shocking and unexpected alliance detailed in the entire book.
Section 5, the cartels and the Catholic Church.
Right.
Honestly, when I first read that chapter title in the outline, I thought it had to be a typo. The cartels and the Vatican working on the same project.
It sounds totally absurd on its face, but Schweitzer says just follow the money and then follow the ideology. Let's look at the cartels first.
Okay, the cartels.
Human smuggling has become just as profitable, if not more profitable, than running drugs. It is a multi-billion-dollar global industry now.
Which makes grim sense, because with drugs, you sell a kilo of fentanyl once, and it's gone. But a person pays you thousands to cross the border. Then they are indebted to you, so they pay you a cut of their wages for years. Then their family back home pays you.
Exactly. It's a brutal subscription model for human trafficking. And Schweitzer alleges deep systemic links between the ruling Mexican Party Marina and these cartel interests.
He discusses the hugs, not billets policy.
Right. The policy championed by AMLO and continued by Scheinbaum, the stated idea was to stop fighting the cartels militarily to reduce civilian violence.
But in practice?
In practice, Schweitzer argues it basically amounted to a state surrender. It gave the cartels free rein to operate. They completely took over the northern migration routes. They literally charge a tax, a toll, for every single human being that crosses the U.S. border.
So the more open and chaotic the U.S. border is, the richer and more powerful the cartels get.
They have a massive vested financial interest in ensuring the border remains porous.
Okay, so that is the profit motive. Criminals want more money, so traffic more people. That's evil, but it makes logical sense. But the church, how does the Vatican fit into this?
This is where it moves from profit to pure ideology. Schweitzer dedicates a significant portion of the book to analyzing Pope Francis and his geopolitical worldview.
Now, obviously, the Catholic Church has a 2,000-year mission of charity and helping the poor.
Yes, and nobody disputes the genuine charity of everyday Catholics. But Schweitzer argues that the Vatican, under the specific leadership of Pope Francis, actively encourages global disruption.
Disruption of what, exactly?
Of Western capitalism and national borders. The Pope has frequently, in his writings and speeches, framed the United States and Western Europe as individualistic, hyper-capitalist evils that need to be fundamentally humbled.
So he views migration as a tool for that humbling.
He views mass migration as a divine mechanism to force wealth redistribution on a global scale, to break down the borders of the rich nations and force them to share their wealth with the global south.
So when massive organizations like Catholic Charities act as a logistics hub at the border,
moving millions of migrants north, feeding them, providing them with legal aid, giving them maps to cross, Schweitzer argues they are framing it to the public as biblical compassion. But operationally, on a geopolitical level, it functions as political subversion.
it facilitates the exact same strategy that the Mexican state and the cartels are using, just for different reasons.
It's a terrifying convergence of interests. That's the scariest part of the book's thesis. The cartels want infinite money. The Mexican state wants political leverage and demographic reconquest. The Chinese want strategic weakness and a Manchurian generation. The domestic political left wants permanent voters. And the church leadership wants ideological transformation.
All of these massive, powerful forces converging on one geographic point of the U.S. border. It's a perfect storm.
And that brings us out of the book's theory and directly into today, February 23rd, 2026.
Right, because this isn't just history anymore. This isn't just an academic book review of some abstract theory. These are the chaotic headlines we are waking up to this morning. Let's talk about Operation Metro Surge.
This is the current flashpoint that is tearing the country apart right now. The Trump administration, in its second term, launched a massive, unprecedented ICE operation in Minnesota last week.
And a lot of people were asking, why Minnesota? Of all places, why start the massive surge in the upper Midwest instead of Texas or California?
The stated reason from the DHS memos was to root out massive systemic fraud. The source material references allegations of huge daycare and food aid fraud rings, specifically linked to certain enclaves, including the Somali communities in the Twin Cities.
We've seen reports of hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars being siphoned off through these phantom daycare centers.
Right, and the administration argued this wasn't just local petty theft.
It was national security.
Exactly. They tracked the money and argued it was flowing out of the country, funding foreign militant interests abroad. So they sent in ICE. Hard.
But the operation turned violent almost immediately.
It escalated incredibly quickly. You had heavily armed federal agents conducting no-knock raids on community centers and apartment complexes.
Yeah.
And then came the legal pushback. The ruling from federal Judge Goodwin.
The secret police ruling.
Right. Judge Goodwin issued an emergency injunction ruling against the use of masked ICE agents without visible badge numbers. He explicitly called it a secret police tactic and ruled it violated the Fourth Amendment protections against unreasonable search and seizure.
But the federal agents didn't stand down. They ignored the injunction.
No, the administration cited potential powers under the Insurrection Act, claiming local authorities were in open rebellion. They pushed forward. And in the chaos, people died.
Renee Good, she was a U.S. citizen, right?
Yes, a U.S. citizen caught in the crossfire during a raid in St. Paul. And Alex Preddy, a VA nurse who was trying to provide medical aid. Both of them were killed by federal agents during the surge.
Just absolute tragedies. And those deaths haven't just sparked outrage. They have become massive rallying cries.
They've turned what started as a policy dispute over immigration fraud into an active, kinetic conflict on American streets.
And the resistance we're seeing, I mean, I'm looking at the protests in Minneapolis on the monitors. This isn't just people holding cardboard signs and chanting.
No, it is highly organized, highly sophisticated resistance. On January 23rd, just last month, they organized the economic blackout.
The general strike.
Right. 50,000 protesters effectively shut down the entire city of Minneapolis. They have tactical communication networks now.
I saw they were using high-frequency whistles to alert whole neighborhoods when IC convoys were approaching.
Whistles, encrypted apps, physical barricades, and the boycotts, they launched the No Housing for IC campaign, threatening to destroy the businesses of any local hotels that allowed federal agents to sleep there.
And Schweitzer actually points out a really dark irony about all of this in the book, doesn't he? The imperial boomerang.
The imperial boomerang, it's a political science concept. It's the idea that the aggressive tactics an empire develops and uses abroad eventually find their way back home to be used on the domestic population.
So, militarized policing, the drones, the counterinsurgency tactics we used in places like Baghdad or Kabul
are now being deployed by the federal government in Minneapolis. But crucially, the insurgency tactics that were used against our troops abroad, the IEDs, the block-by-block resistance, those are now being used by the protesters in Minneapolis, too. The war came home.
And looming over all of this, the chaos, the tear gas, the tragic deaths of citizens, is the United States Supreme Court.
April 2026. This is the endgame. The oral arguments on birthright citizenship are scheduled.
And the administration's legal strategy hinges on this book.
They are formally using Schweitzer's book, The Invisible Coup, as a primary evidentiary document in their Supreme Court briefs.
They are going to stand before the 9 justices and argue that the 14th Amendment itself is actively being weaponized to destroy the country.
Yes. They will argue that because foreign powers like China and Mexico are strategically using birthright citizenship to subvert U.S. sovereignty through the Manchurian generation and the anchor baby strategy, it is no longer just a domestic civil rights issue.
It has mutated into a critical national security vulnerability.
Exactly. They are asking the court for a ruling that would legally justify a sweeping executive order to end birthright citizenship for all non-citizens.
If that happens, I mean, if the court actually agrees with that argument, that changes the fundamental definition of what it means to be an American. It permanently alters the fabric of the country.
It completely rewrites the social contract. It moves the United States away from just the right of the soil where anyone born here is a citizen to something entirely different based on blood or strict legal status. And that is exactly where Schweitzer leaves us at the end of the book.
The synthesis of it all. What does this grand, terrifying theory actually mean for the future of the country?
He argues that at its core, this entire conflict is about Westphalian sovereignty.
Let's break that term down for the listener before we wrap up. Westphalian sovereignty.
It refers to the Peace of Westphalia, the treaty from 1648 that literally defined the modern concept of the nation-state. It established a very simple rule. This is my land. I make the laws within these borders. You stay out.
The foundation of modern global politics.
Right. But Schweitzer argues that idea is dead. It is being intentionally eroded by this weaponized migration. The invisible coup works because it doesn't attack our weaknesses. It exploits America's greatest strengths.
Our openness, our legal system.
Our openness, our strict adherence to the rule of law, our cultural compassion, all of those virtues are being mathematically turned into weapons against us by powers that don't share those values.
Schweitzer has a final thought right at the very end of the book that really stuck with me.
The quote about treason.
Yes. He writes, quote, "A nation can survive fools, but it cannot survive treason from within."
And he adds a really poignant follow-up to that. He says, the traitor isn't always a person in a dark room. Sometimes it's a policy that slowly rots the soul of the nation.
That is the ultimate warning of the book.
It is.
So, as we watch the footage of the protests burning in Minneapolis and Los Angeles today, and as we wait for the Supreme Court to hand down a ruling that could alter history in April, that is the question you, the listener, are left with.
Is this just a tragic, mismanaged humanitarian crisis? Or is it a completely new form of invisible warfare, where you, the American citizen, are the intended target?
And if it is warfare, are we already too late? Have we already lost?
It is incredibly heavy stuff, and honestly, terrifying to consider.
Look, we always say this at the end of the show, but today it matters more than ever. Read the sources for yourself, pick up the Invisible Coup, read the DHS memos, look at the upcoming Supreme Court filings.
Do not just take our summary as gospel. Decide for yourself what you believe is happening to this country.
Always. Critical thinking is practically the only defense mechanism we have left in this environment.
And to leave you with one final thought to mull over, we've spent this whole hour talking about physical migration, people crossing physical borders. But if Schweitzer is right, and foreign powers are using our own systems against us, what happens when this strategy goes fully digital? When they start using our own AI and data networks to engineer social collapse without sending a single person across the border? The invisible coup might already have a digital sequel.
Now that is a terrifying thought to end on. But that's it for this deep dive. We will be closely watching the headlines and the Supreme Court docket. Stay safe out there, everyone.